In the last session, I talked about various issues in covering local media as a journalist. I said that attending a city council meeting can be confusing and disorienting. You expect meetings to be crystal clear with everything explained in context, but it often isn't like that for a journalist, and particularly a new journalist. Sometimes it feels like there are strict, unknown, incomprehensible rules in the midst of chaos and random chance. The members of local government can use technical terms you don't know. They can be thinking in terms of past history and a context they know, but you don't know. And covering court cases the first time feels the same way. I also said that this difficulty is an opportunity for journalism. Local government often has the greatest and most immediate impact on citizens, and yet it is so complex and so poorly understood by local citizens. So the citizens need the media to interpret and make the complexity understandable. It also takes time for a citizen to sit through a 2-hour meeting or to watch the local cable TV station. So citizens need the media to save them time by summarizing a long meeting into a story that gives them the essence to read in 10 minutes and makes it understandable. I also talked about who sets the news agenda, government agencies or independent journalists. And the problem for the media in maintaining an independent news agenda is based on resources like the number of reporters available at a time that declining revenue in the media reduces the number of reporters. I outlined some main issues in local government such as municipal government passes taxation for property that's residential, retail, and industrial. The municipal government passes bylaws that are applied on a municipal level. The municipal government deals with property zoning, which is a huge issue. And today I'm going to talk more about zoning. And municipal government creates services for citizens such as maintenance of roads, water mains, and sewers, and it funds the municipal police force. Thus, protecting citizens from crime comes from the funding of the municipal police force through taxpayers, and the municipal government is able to control the amount of money spent on policing. Another type of local municipal government is the school board. The school board sets its own taxation rate, and that affects all families with school-age children from kindergarten to grade 12. I also gave some practical tips on covering a council meeting, which could also be applied to covering any type of meeting. Okay, planning and zoning. Municipalities have the legal authority to decide how land will be used within the municipality. That means that if you buy land inside the municipality, you are limited and restricted by the legal control of the municipality on your land and what you can and can't do with your property. For example, I own a house in Kamloops, and I want to cut down the big tree at the front of the property, which puts everything in shadow, but I can't cut it down because the city has what is called an easement at the front of the property where the sidewalk is. An easement is an agreement in some legal rights over your property. An easement might be a road across your land or electrical power lines across your land. In my case, half of my big tree is legally controlled by the city, and the city says I can't cut down the tree. The city byline requires me to shovel the snow on the sidewalk in front of my house, even if I'm feeling tired that day. I can't add an extension to my house if it comes too close to the property line. I can have 2 dogs, but not 3 dogs, but my wife is allergic to dogs, so we're not going to have dogs. I can't have a rooster, even if I wanted one. I can't rent my basement to a tenant without making expensive changes required by the municipality, although there are plenty of illegal basement rental suites in Kamloops. I can't build a small house in my backyard and sell it as a separate property because the property zoning will not allow that, and so on and so on. You get the point. The city government creates a lot of legal restrictions on my property that I have to obey. I can go to the city government to request an exemption called a minor variance. The city could give me a variance, but is also aware that when it creates an exemption for one person, then other people might want an exemption too. These property rules limit me, but they also protect me and my property. My neighbor can't have a dog kennel without an exemption, which my neighbor had before I bought the property. Thus, when I bought my house, there was an already established dog kennel next door. The house next door was just sold, and so the dog kennel is gone. The situation I just described is from one view of a single property owner, but when you add the numbers up, there are a lot of single property owners in Kamloops. According to the 2016 census of Kamloops, Statistics Canada says that there are 39,081 homes in Kamloops. If you operated a newspaper, that demographic would suggest the maximum number of subscriptions you could sell, since a householder usually buys no more than one subscription. Thus, the Kamloops Daily News had a circulation about between 11 and 12,000 when it folded in 2014, or about 30% of the homes in Kamloops. Kamloops This Week says it is circulated to 30,000 homes, or about 77% of the households, but Kamloops This Week has free distribution, which allows it to attract advertisers by saying it can reach more homes, and thus advertisers can reach more people. So Kamloops has 39,000 homes that are affected by the power of the local government to set the residential tax rate and limit the use of land. Municipal government also creates a plan for the land use development every 5 years. And the plan is a public document, and now you can get it online and download it. That plan can affect growth in the city and more growth in some areas with less growth in other areas. And it can manage an increase in homes, businesses, and industries. And when I came to Kamloops and was looking at buying and selling a house and wanted to know advantages and disadvantages of living in certain areas, I would look at the city plan to see things, particularly since the city plan had a hazard map in it which showed the danger areas in Kamloops. That's the danger areas for flooding, the danger areas for wildfires, the danger area for slides, since there's often slopes in Kamloops. I paid attention to those things, partly because I had, as a newspaper reporter, attended municipal planning board meetings in Ontario and knew the issues. For example, flooding. Okay, the North Shore of Kamloops has low altitude and is prone to flooding. And so if you look at the hazard map in the city plan, you can see what areas of Kamloops, such as along the North Shore, are vulnerable to flooding. And that's obviously going to be a factor in your property if you buy on the North Shore. And in fact, a couple of years ago, when I was looking at selling one piece of property and buying another piece of property, I looked at properties on the North Shore. I asked the real estate agent, if it is in the floodplain, because the houses there some of them were in the floodplain. And what that meant is you couldn't get flood insurance for being in the floodplain. And so there's a lot of valuable information for you that in a city planning documents. Now, when I talk about things like planning, zoning, those sorts of things, that's all technical, but it has a serious impact on homeowners in ways they may not realize unless the media sets the news agenda and keeps them informed. So when you look at the text for this course, an introduction to news reporting, it has a good section, practical section on municipal reporting, and it raises issues that you can cover on municipal reporting. So, for example, the text talks about growth issues. How fast or how slow is the municipality growing? And what are the issues in either fast growth or slow growth? It's a really fascinating area, and it's a real service that journalists can do to a community by looking at growth issues. And how that would impact an average citizen is that as the municipality grows, the traffic might increase, or there'll be certain traffic bottlenecks that make it difficult for you to get to work and get to various things. Growth issues can also increase taxation as more services are required. And typically in a community, and you take Kamloops as an example, how fast or how slow the municipality is growing has an impact, but different parts of the municipality grow at different rates. And a municipal council can encourage certain parts of the municipality to grow and certain parts of the municipality not to grow. So if you look at the Kamloops plan every 5 years, you see that projected growth is mainly on the South Shore in the Sahalee Aberdeen area, with less growth on the North Shore. As a community grows, then it needs certain services, or as the growth slows down, it may need less services. So, for example, schools. If a part of Kamloops is growing, as it has, then in some areas it needs new schools. It needs a new public school. It needs a new high school. A high school can be crowded. At the same time, if there's slow growth in an area and a decline in the demographic proportions of families, the children in a certain area, the demographic of children may decline, and that has an effect on the school in the area. And so the school population may start to shrink, and a school may even get closed. And that's very painful for a neighborhood. And that becomes a lively issue in journalism coverage when a neighborhood school, the number of children in that area is declining, and the number of students in the school is declining, and the school board considers closing the school, but the parents still there with children. They don't like that because now the children might have to be bused to another school, and typically too, in the past, schools have been a kind of community center where things happen, such as voting, community meetings, things like that. So growth issues have so many aspects, and part of growth issues are how the municipality is doing long-range planning and how that planning could have future impact on citizens in a certain area. The text talks about an issue of the effect of the new global economy or changes in how the economy operates. And certainly we've been seeing ramifications of that in the last few years, and we've seen economic effects just during the COVID pandemic, and we're still going through some of those economic effects. So I mentioned demographic changes, and the text talks about the sort of pressure that demographic changes can create, demographic changes in Kamloops, a city like Kamloops as a whole, or certain regions of the city. And the text says that demographics can have to do with whether or not you have a diversity of forces. And the text has a whole chapter on diversity of forces, chapter 5. And the text says, consider the diversity of demographics in a community, the diversity of income groups, age groups, racial and ethnic groups. It's very hard to serve any kind of diverse community because that creates conflicting interests. I need to plug in so I don't use power. Like I said, it's hard to serve a diversity, hard for municipal government to serve a diverse community because that creates conflicting interests. And those conflicting interests should be represented in a news story so that a news story won't be one-sided. For example, a simple issue in a place like Kamloops, a discussion about snow removal around bus stops makes us look at snow removal from another angle. And this has actually come up to Kamloops City Council in the past because the city had to prioritize the order of snow removal. And there was an issue of people who can't afford cars, who use the bus, but they had trouble getting at the bus stop because the snow removal there was a lower priority. The text highlights issues of planning and zoning, and in a minute I'm going to get a little more deeply into that. But there's so many different issues that have to do with zoning. For example, one I've just given is zoning as a safety issue. The city, as I said, the city of Kamloops maintains hazard zoning where people aren't allowed to build because of the risk of floods, fires, and landslides. And I gave the example of floodplain mapping. That is areas of land close to a river that are more prone to zoning. And of course, you don't see that flooding every year. And because you don't see it every year, citizens may forget that an area is vulnerable to flooding, and they may then build their homes there. But of course, the city can control whether people build their homes in floodplains. So in Kamloops, as I said, the North Shore, the edge of the North Shore, is in floodplain. It's prone to flooding. It hasn't been seen in several years, but you go back not too long in Kamloops, and I can remember the river rising so fast in the spring that they had to put sandbags along the North Shore to protect the homes there from flooding. And when I talk about this, I remember one of my first experiences as a journalist working for a small newspaper covering small municipal councils. And I remember the issue of the floodplain. That is, people would come to council because they wanted to build in the floodplain, and they felt that council was restricting them by not allowing them to build in the floodplain. Now, the council was trying to protect the people by not allowing them to build in the floodplain. They were coming from an exemption of that, but they were trying to protect the people from loss of their property. Well, I remember during my time in reporting in Ontario, where some citizens that a council allowed to build in the floodplain, after their homes got flooded, they sued the municipality for allowing them to build in the floodplain, which is what they wanted to do. So the hazard mapping and the restrictions and planning that a council would do because of that, where a council might not allow citizens to build in a certain zone, protects the citizens against making bad decisions, but also protects the municipality from being blamed later for allowing the citizens to do what they don't want to do. So another type of hazard in Kamloops is fire zones. That is wild areas that are prone to wildfires. And also because given the topography of Kamloops with slopes, these kind of low mountains that come from thousands of years ago, glaciers gouging through the area and changing the topography, that's created steep slopes in Kamloops. And certain areas will be prone to landslides in Kamloops. Sometimes the soil is so sandy that it's prone to that. Well, there are zoning restrictions in Kamloops that don't prevent people from building on slopes that are too steep and would be prone to slides. And that's something that the planning actually protects people from making bad decisions. When you get into planning issues in the municipality, there's an opposition between the marketplace versus planning. That is, what really has control? The marketplace, the demand, or the city government? So if there's a demand, a market demand for more houses in a city like Kamloops, should it simply follow whatever the marketplace wants, which could be haphazard and could interfere with people in the end? Or should the city restrict and plan it at the disadvantage of inhibiting the marketplace? So who has control over land use, the marketplace or the planning? And can a city council oppose the marketplace and still survive politically? And I remember one time talking to the director of planning service for the Thompson Nicola Regional District, which is the district government just outside Kamloops. And he said, it's, quote, a losing game, end quote, to try to regulate developments, such as protecting a downtown business against malls. He said, quote, he told me, you can't fight the marketplace, end quote. So the example I've just given in a municipality, it has a downtown area but big box stores want to open up and malls want to open up in the suburbs. And this has particularly been a factor in larger cities than Kamloops, but it's still a factor in Kamloops. So should the city council let the marketplace have free reign, and every time a big box developer or a developer wants to build a mall in a more suburban area of Kamloops, should the developer be allowed to do that? The cost will be against the downtown and the downtown established businesses, because they may lose business. And in losing business in the downtown core, you can sometimes lose the character and centrality of a community. And that's a phenomenon that we've seen happening in Canada and the United States over several decades. I'm from London, Ontario, and when I was growing up, the downtown in London, Ontario was a vibrant city core. But as malls were built on cheaper land at the edges of the municipality and suburban areas, the downtown core declined. It declined quite drastically, and businesses just couldn't survive. The nature of the businesses changed, and it was not only effect on the established businesses in town, but it had an effect on how the community was organized. It just lost that city center where everybody went and could mingle, and now it was divided up into suburbs. Well, municipal governments can control that sort of thing. But like I said, can they fight the marketplace? Because the marketplace, of course, can be looking at regenerating the economy of municipality, but sometimes at the expense of the existing businesses. And I'll give you another example. A few years ago in Kamloops, there was a proposal to build a tall apartment building on a piece of property just off campus near the Canadian Superstore. And the Canadian Superstore, by the way, is built on an old city landfill with methane in it, which was causing the parking lot to sink. Now, if the apartment building were in a residential area, that would affect property values. Because if you're in a residential area with single family homes and somebody erects a high density apartment building, that actually can decrease your property value because it's less desirable, or it can go up next door to you and the tall apartment building blocks your view. That actually happened to me in Kamloops. At one time, I had a condo, and in the south area, a small building, but it had a great view, and the property across the street was zoned that would prevent a tall apartment building going in there. And when I bought the condo, I said, well, that's great, because the property zoning opposite my property protects me against an apartment building going up and blocking my view. Well, sure enough, after a couple of years, a developer bought that piece of property opposite me, which had been a church, which had lost its congregation, and so it was empty. And so some people would break into it at night and sleep in a corner. And a developer bought that property. The zoning would not allow the developer to build an apartment building, which is, like I said, one reason why I thought my condo was a good deal. However, the buyer of the property went to the municipal government and got a zoning changed that allowed the developer to build a 5-story apartment building, which would block my view. And you can be sure I wasn't too happy about that. And the sale, the developer buying the property might have been contingent and conditional on a zoning change. That is, you don't want to buy a property to put up an apartment building needing a zoning change. You buy the property, you can't get the zoning change. So probably there was a conditional deal on that. So the effect on me, and that's typical, was that I thought I was protected by the zoning, but you can always get a change to the zoning. And I sold that property a few years ago. So I've just given you some illustrations of how issues of economics and growth and zoning are all linked together. The text in another section also talks about utilities and how that's a coverage area, and so on. Other things the text talks about, it's got a really good section on municipal reporting. It talks about limited revenue capacity. That is, there's only so many dollars in a municipality that the government has that it can raise through taxation. And so the municipal government has to make choices how to spend that revenue. They can't give everybody everything they want, and it has to make choices. The text talks about suburbanization and urban sprawl, which are growth issues. I've just talked about that in terms of how retail growth, suburbs and retail growth can affect the downtown core. So in Kamloops, around the university, that's the Lower Sahalee area, it was a residential area, but in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of malls and stores and restaurants have gone in there, and that serves that residential pocket well, but it also detracts from the needs of those people to use downtown businesses. And like I said, it's been a phenomenon, a link to the automobile happening over decades, that because the automobile, people could live farther from where they work, farther from the center of a municipality, and you have these suburban developments, you have urban sprawl, you have these issues of how it affects the economics in a community, and growth issues. New residents and new industries mean more taxation, but they also mean added costs and added pressure. So when there's a growth in a certain area, as for example in Kamloops, the southern edge of the city has been developing quickly. The Aberdeen area, that area has been growing with new houses, new apartment buildings. I'm going to talk about the zoning issue a little bit detail in a moment. But then that created the need, that growth created the need for the city to spend more money on constructing roads, roads maintenance, snow removal. Aberdeen needed its own public school because there were so many families with children. It needed its own fire station, and those things cost money to build. The residents of the Aberdeen in themselves might not produce enough tax revenue to build a new school or to build a fire hall, so the whole municipality may have to provide revenue for the growth in one area. The course text talks about the issue of education issues. That is, how can the municipality produce measures to deal with social problems, such as delinquency, drug use, that sort of thing. And the text also talks about changes in city governments and how roles and relationships change. So now I want to dig a little more deeply into the issues of zoning and rezoning. It's a technical issue. It's a fascinating technical issue. And like I said, residents commonly don't understand the technical issue of zoning and rezoning, but it can have a big impact on them. As the example I just gave of myself of a property rezoning to allow a 5-story apartment building to go up and block my view. So the zoning is a series of legal measures that a municipality passes that control land use. And the control of land use through zoning is a key one in a municipality. It affects a number of things. It affects finances, it affects safety, it affects the local economy, it affects the environment, roads, the transit system, recreation facilities, and the quality of life. And the land use planning and zoning in a municipality reflects how sensible the planning is for growth, economy, and development. That is, it will be a disservice to the citizens if the municipality mismanages the planning, the zoning, and the growth, and it'll be a benefit to the citizens if the municipality manages the land use well. Zoning affects the value of a property, and that's very important for people, because typically, and I think even more so, the main asset that people have these days is their home or their condo, is the property they own, and the zoning can affect the value of that property, whether the value goes up or down, separate from the marketplace. And right now, it's interesting in Kamloops, the real estate agents tell us that despite the lockdowns and the coronavirus pandemic, that the marketplace for property in Kamloops is booming for sellers. That is, there are more sellers than buyers. More people are wanting to buy property in Kamloops than property is available. That's good news for the property owners. It's bad news for the buyers, because when you have more buyers than you have property, the value of the property goes up. People get competitive. The bidding gets competitive. And so real estate agents say in Kamloops that because of what they call inventory, the smaller number of properties for sale relative buyers, that property is now being bought above the asking price because of the competition. Well, that's the marketplace, and how the marketplace affects the value of property, the prime asset that people have. Well, zoning can affect the value of property as well, and property value can be affected by neighboring developments and what businesses can do and not do, and so the typical types of zoning in a municipality are residential, industrial, agricultural, commercial, recreational, and hazard. Those are the typical zones and that the municipal government creates. And each of those zones have subzones. So residential property zones can the zoning can vary in different parts of the city. As an example is density. Zoning will determine how many people can occupy a certain piece of land, whether it can be high density or low density, and the size of the land. That is, in a specific residential zone, there will be a minimum size of a lot, and you can't have a lot smaller than that size. And it varies in different parts of a municipality. So in some parts of Kamloops, the minimum size will be smaller, and in other parts it will be larger. So each zone, such as a residential zone, will have a number of subzones. So I talked about density, okay? And density is the number of people on a piece of land. So if a residential area only allows single-family homes and not apartment buildings, the density will be lower. If the residential zoning allows for apartment buildings, the density or number of people will be higher. Now, people who want to live in single-family homes, they generally value a residential area that doesn't have high-density apartment buildings. That is, they don't live right next door to an apartment building with a lot of people, a lot of traffic. Their view is blocked. Their garden is in the shadow of the apartment building. So people value, some citizens value low density or relative low density residential areas, where other people value high density. That is, they can't afford to have a single family home, or their work conditions, they prefer an apartment. So they want higher density. They want to live in an apartment building, and they want to maybe buy a condo. So the preferences are different there, and there's a conflict between those preferences. And so the city typically separates those things. So it will have residential areas with low density where apartment buildings aren't allowed. And it will have other areas of high density where apartments are allowed. And a city can even control the height of the buildings, the number of stories of the buildings. So typically in British Columbia, which tends to be a rocky, mountainous, slopey area, high density planning is allowed. And you see some of that in Kamloops. Some of that in Kamloops as well. So this is a quality of life issue, and it is a value of assets issue. The zoning in residential areas and the density, and of course, the residential areas only allow residential property, not industries. And in Kamloops, a lot of the residential zoning does not allow for retail stores. So when you go into an area of Kamloops in the south area, Upper Sahalee, Aberdeen, you see very few stores, even corner stores. That's because of the zoning, and that's considered a quality of life issue. So the zoning and municipalities protect the value of their assets and the quality of their life in residential areas through zones, and they keep the industrial and commercial areas separate, because in retail areas, people tend not to want industries around the retail areas. And so that's a typical separation between residential zoning commercial zoning or retail zoning and industrial zoning. Now, a rezoning near property can change the value of the property being bought or the neighboring property. So, for example, hypothetically, imagine that a residential area suddenly gets an industrial rezoning next to it, or it gets a subdivision that gets new high-density apartment buildings. That zoning change of adjacent property can affect the lifestyle of the existing homeowners and the value of their property. I'll give you a really simple example of how zoning can affect lifestyle. A few years ago, the Kamloops City Council decided that part of the quality of life in Kamloops for existing residents was not having adult video stores in their areas. Actually, we're thinking back to times when people were video stores were more in existence than they are now. So the city council realized that citizens didn't want adult video stores in some areas, particularly areas close to schools or hockey arenas, sports areas where young kids would go. They realized that some of the citizens feel there was a benefit to zoning that would prevent these adult video stores, and there was a bit of a struggle about that, and a problem with existing adult video stores. So that's a really simple example of a quality of life issue. You got a young family, got little kids, you don't want to be taking them to the sports arena past the adult video store and the kid asking, what is that? What is that? Okay, very simple example. Huge amounts of money can be at stake in rezoning property. So rezoning land, say rezoning land from agriculture to residential, usually means that the property is suddenly worth a lot more to the developer. It's virtually an instant gold mine. And one of the local municipal planners that I talked to one time calls zoning issues, quote, the last of the blood sports, unquote. And he said it would get ugly in the public hearing stages. And he said the developer is the person who builds our cities. The developer is the person who invests in the growth of a city. And so city governments want to encourage growth. At the same time, they want to control it. And they have to deal with conflicting interests. Growth may be a benefit, an economic benefit, a benefit in access to things, but it can also be negative, felt as a loss to people. So there's those conflicts in zoning. And the local government has to protect the interests of the taxpayers by making sure the municipality is well planned and fits the needs of the community. But the guidelines for development mean nothing until a private developer with money decides to build. And so that's why cities create incentives for developers to encourage a developer to come and invest in the growth of a municipality and build homes and build retail stores and build industries, things that have both a positive and negative value. So developers need incentives, but at the same time, the city needs to exercise some sort of control. An example of that would be several years ago when there was a mine development planned just on the edge of Kamloops. And it was a huge public issue. People were driving around the city with bumper stickers that indicated were they for or against the mine. It was a contentious issue with the city government. There was a split on council. There was a split in the community. And so, in really simplistic terms, a company wanted to expand a mine on the edge of Kamloops. That would create growth, economic growth. It would create jobs. It would create revenue. And it would increase the population, and it would increase the population. That would benefit businesses. But at the same time, there were issues of pollution, how this, the effects of the mine, and there were discussions of with blasting. Will you have, will the blasting be shaking the earth, and will it damage buildings? And what happens to the water in the area with the mine? So there were environmental issues, plus the life of the mine was calculated at 29 years. So for 29 years, that would mean a growth in jobs, growth in people moving here, buying houses. But at the end of the 29 years, as the mine ended its life cycle, that would end. And so if the community grew economically in terms of population and property values because of the mine, 29 years down the road, it would be affected by the closing of the mine. I come from Ontario, and when you go into northern Ontario, you see the effects in parts of Quebec. You see the effects on a town that had a mine that pumped up the economy, and then and grew the town and grew the commercial business of the town, and then the mine closes, and you see the effect on the community. And that can be quite sad, because the community has grown and sustained itself on this industry. When the industry goes out, that growth then shrinks, it detracts, stores close, it changes things. Now, I mentioned that there is huge amounts of money in rezoning property. I said it's a gold mine. And I'm going to take an example that happened a few years in Kamloops with a subdivision called Pine Acres, which was built several years ago and has been growing. So the Pine Acres subdivision in Kamloops was originally 160 acres in an agricultural zone. And because there was an agricultural zone and there were no houses in there, because it was an agricultural zone, you couldn't build houses. It was the wrong type of zone. And the province of BC is protective about agriculture areas because it wants to make sure there is enough agricultural land. Well, in terms of the marketplace set the value of land in an agricultural zone of this 160 acres. And that means that if you want to sell that 160 acres of agricultural land, you're only going to be able to get what's the marketplace for agricultural land. Well, a developer bought the 160 acres at the value of agricultural zone, and then got the land rezoned for property, and that increased the value of that 160 acres by allowing homes, a subdivision of homes. So let me give you a hypothetical situation. It's not based on the actual numbers of this development, but hypothetically, let's look at it. Okay, so hypothetically, say we start with 160 acres and we rezone it to allow for 1,000 houses, each on 0.16 of an acre. Okay. That means that the value of the land, the original, say the land originally at agricultural values was worth $5,000 an acre. For 160 acres, that agricultural land would be worth $800,000. It gets property developer buys it, gets it rezoned for 1,000 houses, each on 0.16 acre, and that increases the value of the land from $5,000 an acre to $40,000 an acre. So the land that was originally worth $800,000 is now worth $40 million. So imagine, that's what I meant by saying rezoning is a gold mine. Just rezoning the property. The developer wouldn't even have to build the homes. Just the property, the developer rezoning the agricultural land to residential land increased the value of the worth from $800,000 to $40 million. So that, I mean, it's really hard to get a return on that size of return on investment that quickly. Like I said, the developer doesn't even have to build the homes. The developer just sell lots. If the developer builds homes, now the developer can make more money out of that rezoning because the developer can build the homes and then sell the home to make a profit against what it costs to build the home. So imagine that in that example, an investment of $800,000 in a relatively short time, it now produces land worth $40 million. Now, in these circumstances, a municipality may agree to this rezoning because the municipality wants the population of the city to grow. It will increase the tax revenue, but there is a cost to growth. So in a subdivision, there's the cost of roads, sewers, electrical lines buried, snow removal, and typically a municipality wants the developer to pay for some of those costs. So typically when a municipality agrees to rezoning in a case like this, it will require that the developer pay for paving the roads, putting in water and sewer services, putting in street lights, reserving land for parkland, which doesn't produce revenue for the developer, and landscaping. And so that's also that the taxpayers don't have to pay for that. So that takes away some of the profit of the developer. But on costs of property worth $800,000 and then being worth $40 million, a few $1 million in these kinds of costs is well worth it to the employer. So the Pine Acres subdivision years ago came up to rezoning in Kamloops, and the rezoning was passed after a public hearing that took only 90 minutes. There really wasn't much opposition to it. Also consider that zoning is a safety issue. The municipality needs to protect people, even in terms of traffic volume. That is, if you live in a residential area, you won't be happy to see a factory go up at the end of the street. That will decrease your property value, but also you'll have a lot more traffic. You can have trucks going up and down the street. Now you've got a safety issue with the kids. Is it safe for the kids to play in the street now with these big these trucks going up or down? I'm just going to end on one more example of planning. When Canada decided to legalize marijuana, it created the opportunity for people to open marijuana stores. And then that became an issue of the city council. Where will it allow marijuana stores and where won't it allow marijuana stores? And how many marijuana stores will it allow in Kamloops? So the city has control over that because it would see opening a marijuana store as having an effect on it and wants to control that sort of thing. And so typically the province said that marijuana stores will be banned in areas frequented by children, such as community beaches, parks, and playgrounds. And so the Kamloops City Council decided that it needed to create zoning to control how many marijuana stores there would be in Kamloops and where they would be located. And what the city council decided is that obviously it's not going to allow marijuana stores in residential areas, and it looked at specific zones, commercial zones, where it would allow these sorts of things.